Hello, Alex here, and in this video I want to go over the process of selecting and using either the focal plane shutter or the in-lens leaf shutter when using a leaf shutter lens on a 200 or 2000 series focal plane Hasselblad camera body. Let's get into it. Relatively recently, one of my friends put his 2000 series Hasselblad body up for sale, and there were some queries and a bit of interest from people who were maybe thinking about it, but didn't want to commit because they didn't want to fork out the cash basically for the relatively fewer and more expensive focal plane series lenses, the F and FE line, as opposed to the much cheaper and more abundant leaf shutter lenses, the C, CF, and CFI lenses. What they didn't know is that you can use a leaf shutter lens on the focal plane bodies. That's where the FC in the name for this FCM comes from. F for the focal plane shutter, C for the synchro compor leaf shutters in the lenses that have leaf shutters, and M for modification or whatever else in the case of the 2000 FCM. The point is that you can choose to use either the focal plane shutter or the leaf shutter on a shot-by-shot basis. And in this video, I want to show you how you actually go about that and a couple of things you need to be mindful of. This is my 2000 FCM with the Zeiss Planar 110mm f2, the bokeh monster. You can identify the difference between and distinguish between these F-series lenses and the C-series lenses by the fact that the F-series lenses don't have a shutter speed selection dial on the barrel. You have a focusing ring as normal, you have your aperture ring, but there is no shutter speed dial because there's no shutter in the lens. And of course you have the EV lock and EV scale like any other Hasselblad lens. These bodies and these lenses work together because the body has an internal focal plane shutter in the rear. This takes the place of the auxiliary shutter, the barn doors in a normal Hasselblad, so you don't have barn doors on these cameras, and this shutter will act as our auxiliary shutter when we're using the leaf shutter lenses. Instead, you just have a shutter speed selection dial around the lens mount on the body. The shutter speeds range from 1/2000th of a second in half-stop increments down to 1 second, plus bulb mode, which is fairly self-explanatory, plus this C mode. And this C mode is what you want to ideally use when using the leaf shutter lenses. C for synchro compor again. Where this gets more complicated is when you attach the leaf shutter lens to the focal plane body, because now you have two shutter speed selection dials, one on the lens and one at the lens mount of the body. This is tricky because I don't know how well known this is, both shutters will always fire. There is no way that I know of to only fire one of them. So you need to make sure that the shutter you are using to take the picture, so in this case the obvious example would be something like using the leaf shutter with flash at say 1/250th of a second, to make sure that the other shutter is a slower shutter speed so that the full exposure is controlled by the shutter that you want. So in this case, if I set the lens on the shutter in the lens to 1/250th of a second for flash purposes, for example, and I set the focal plane shutter to half a second and take a picture, I will get an exposure of 1/250th of a second. If I leave my flash plugged into the port on the lens here and set this shutter to 1/2000th of a second, I'm getting a 1/2000th of a second exposure and the flash isn't going to work because you're using a focal plane shutter. So it's very important to remember that you have that the correct way around. Again, ideally you would use the C setting on the shutter speed dial on the body for the C lenses, and there is a lock on the side where, regardless of what shutter speed you choose, if you're controlling things with the leaf shutter lens, set this little lever here to the L position to lock it. And now the shutter speed selection dial on the body won't move and potentially move to a position where you would get, uneven or completely failed exposures. So on the flip side, say there's a lens I own that I only have a C or CFI version of because either it doesn't exist in the focal plane line or I just can't afford it, for example. If I want to use the focal plane shutter for whatever reason, what I need to do is set the shutter on the lens to like 1 second or bulb. Ideally you would use bulb, and then set the focal plane shutter using the dial around the lens mount to whatever setting you actually want to use. In this case, we'll say 1/30th of a second. So when I push this button, the focal plane shutter will open for 1/30th of a second, and hopefully over me talking you heard the whir of the clockwork as the leaf shutter stayed open for 1 second. I'll do that again real quick and you should see the leaf shutter this time. So the leaf shutter was open for 1 full second, but the focal plane shutter was only open during that 1 second for 1/30th of a second, giving an exposure of 1/30th of a second. Another caveat is that say I want to do a 1 second exposure using the leaf shutter, again for whatever reason, and I have the body set to C. The focal plane shutter, acting as an auxiliary shutter, will only stay open as long as I'm holding the button. So hopefully, if I stop talking, you will hear the focal plane shutter open and close as I press and release the button instead of correctly holding it down until the end of the exposure. And then after the focal plane shutter closes, you will still hear the clockwork whirring as that 1 second exposure goes on. And in that case, I would have had, I don't know, 1/4 of a second exposure instead of 1 full second because I did not correctly hold the focal plane shutter open for the correct amount of time. You might ask what the difference between C mode and B mode is. Honestly, I'm not 100% sure. As far as I can tell, they both allow the focal plane shutter to stay open as long as you hold the button. Except the fact that the C position is marked, dedicated, whatever. I have read some people, or well, 2 people online say that you don't need a battery if you're using C mode, and that's not true. If I take the camera's cocked, if I take the battery out right now, and I fire this shutter, the rear blind does not close. Okay, the leaf shutter closed, but now I cannot cock the camera. I can't advance anything. If I put the battery back in and very quickly just touch the shutter button, now it closes because it's restored power. So it is worth noting that the C mode isn't like a mechanical hack to use these cameras without power, say for night photography. That is a misconception that I had when I bought this lens, was that I would be able to shoot in C mode at night without worrying about battery power, which is an issue I've had. It is possible that the C mode uses much less power than the B mode. Maybe the C mode only actuates the shutter electronically, whereas B mode holds it open. I have no idea how the internals of this camera actually work. That is purely speculation on my part. But it is worth noting that the functional difference between them is very small, except for one very small other thing that most people won't encounter. Leaf shutter lenses have a flash sync port, as they all do, to trigger flash so you can actually sync them correctly. But the body has a flash port as well, and you can use it up to its sync speed of 1/90th of a second with the focal plane shutter, and I have done that with the 110 previously. But if you set this dial anywhere from X, 1/90th, down to bulb mode, any of these white settings, either of these will work. If you set it to C, only the one on the lens will work. It completely disconnects the PC sync port on the body and prevents it from operating. Maybe there's a niche case where you're working in a studio and you're changing lenses very frequently. It might be helpful for you to not have to disconnect and reconnect the PC sync port every time if you're shooting with flash. Or alternatively, maybe your PC sync port on your lens is just busted and you can't get it repaired. In that case, being able to use this one would be useful, the one on the body, in which case you'd have to use B mode rather than C mode. That's an extremely limited case, I know, but it is potentially worth knowing for somebody. So it isn't too complex, but it is a little bit finicky, and there are some things you need to bear in mind, especially regarding the priority and which shutter speed is slower and all that kind of thing. That said, it is doable. You can do it shot to shot, like I said, and it's not actually that bad in real world shooting. In practice, you get into a groove of doing it relatively easily. It also serves as a bit of reassurance that if you're thinking about buying one of these bodies, or if you own one now, to know that if the focal plane shutter does get damaged and can't be repaired, that you can just sell your focal plane lenses, if you have any, and buy the leaf shutter equivalents and still use the camera, which I guess is nice. That's all I have to say for this video, so stay safe and bye bye for now. If you don't already, follow me on Instagram at Shaka1277 for new pictures every day. If you liked this video and enjoy what I do on the channel, please consider subscribing or checking out my Patreon, where the tiers start at just €1 per month.